Alright, so if you have been following me on Instagram, you have realized that I've just posted all the photos of the notes that I've been using on the videos. So do go to my Instagram page. I'll put the link down below, and yeah, let me know if you have any questions as well. So hopefully all these are useful in your revision, and in today's episode we're going to talk about the chapter of health and diseases. So yeah, hopefully you will find this very much useful in your revision, especially knowing that tomorrow is the paper and today it's the 4th of November. So all the best to all of you, and let's start. So in this episode we're going to focus on health and diseases. So the overarching question for this chapter is actually, are we more vulnerable than before? So basically we're going to cover things like, what are some of our vulnerabilities, why is it that some countries are more vulnerable than others for certain types of diseases such as infectious diseases, and then we are also going to look at whether we are really more vulnerable and what are the reasons for it, and what are some of the possible strategies that countries can adopt. Okay, so now, when it comes to human geography, you do notice that one of the main geographical concepts that's often being brought up would be the level of development of the country. And the reason is because if you look at the chapter of tourism, level of development will actually determine whether the country has the financial resources to invest in all the different tourist infrastructure and facilities and services to cater to the demand of the tourists, and therefore they can drive the tourism industry. And then when it comes to the chapter of food, you do notice that the level of development plays an important role, because for countries that have more financial resources, they're able to invest in all the different types of technological advancements, such as irrigation tools or fertilizers, pesticides, HYB seeds, things like that, so that they can actually intensify their food production and reduce the chances of the country experiencing any form of food insecurity. And then when it comes to the chapter of health and diseases, you do notice that the level of development plays a very important role, because the financial resources that the country has will actually determine the quality of the healthcare, will also determine the environmental conditions that the people are living in, and the responses of the government when it comes to emergencies, the sudden emergence of certain disease. They are able to effectively contain that disease and reduce the rate of spread in comparison to countries with limited financial resources. So do take note that for all human geography chapters, the best concept to really consider when you are doing your revision is to consider the level of development. Okay, so now, like I just said, level of development plays a very important role. So in this case, if you look at developed countries, you do notice that in general, they have lower infant mortality rate. I just write it as IMR. So lower infant mortality rate suggests that the quality of healthcare is actually better, right? So with better healthcare, the live births will then be able to have better health, and therefore they will be able to grow into toddlers, into children, into adults. All right, so therefore this is a very good indicator of the quality of healthcare of the country. And then next, life expectancy. The more developed the country in general, the higher the life expectancy. And these 2 points, like I said just now, it's very much linked to the quality of healthcare as well as the standard of living of the individuals. What we mean by standard of living is actually referring to things like, for instance, disposable income, right? The ability to have higher purchasing power, to access to different types of services and facilities such as healthcare. And then we're also talking about standard of living in terms of the living conditions. It is not overcrowded. You have proper infrastructure. You have easy access to safe drinking water. So all these are points that you need to consider when you're talking about standard of living. Okay, and yeah, if you look at developed nations, you do notice that in comparison to the less developed countries, they generally have lower death toll from infectious diseases, and at the same time, you do notice that they are more vulnerable to degenerative diseases. But as for less developed nations, it will be a direct opposite. So for less developed nations, you do notice a higher death toll from infectious diseases, and they are less vulnerable to degenerative diseases. So what I'm going to do now is to go in depth into each of the countries. So we're going to look at developed countries first. Alright, so for developed countries, like I said just now, you do notice that they have a lower death toll from infectious diseases. Now I need to clarify this misconception, and this misconception is something that I notice most of my students tend to have, and they assume that infectious diseases are primarily affecting the LDCs. Now, infectious diseases such as malaria, dengue, cholera can actually affect all countries. However, the thing is that given that infectious diseases can emerge and spread in DCs and LDCs, the differentiating point would be that the death toll is actually higher for LDCs and lower for DCs. So the lower death toll, alright, is because of three main points. First, the level of education of the citizens within the developed nations. So level of education would suggest that the people may be more informed on precautionary measures. So for instance, in Singapore, right, we just a couple of months ago, you keep hearing news about, oh, there is actually an increased number of cases of Zika or dengue fever that's happening in Singapore. And because of the fact that the education level is higher, the people are more willing to take the necessary precautionary measures, and the people also have the understanding of what the disease is about, so that they know that if they actually show certain symptoms, they would just seek the necessary medical attention, right? So that's one thing to note, and then therefore this can actually help them reduce the chance of further spreading the disease, or basically it reduce the overall death toll within the country. Okay, and at the same time, education level can also suggest that in the long run, this population will be able to have higher disposable income, right? Because with greater amounts of educational opportunities, the job opportunities available will be wider, and therefore they might have higher disposable income in the long run, which therefore suggests that they are able to have better access to quality healthcare. So even if it's not found within the country, they're able to fly to other countries. So you study that under medical tourism in the chapter of tourism, right? So at the same time, it also suggests that they're able to afford better healthcare. So that's one thing to note when it comes to education. And the lower death toll due to infectious diseases in DCs can also be contributed by the fact that there is easy access, affordability of healthcare, as well as availability of healthcare. So I call it the 3 A's for my students to easily remember. So just remember accessibility, affordability, and availability. Alright, so within developed nations, because of the fact that there is actually financial resources, right? So the government can actually divert these resources into the healthcare sector to ensure that there's sufficient doctors, professionals to provide the necessary quality healthcare. So do take note that healthcare is actually very important in this case. And lastly, in DCs, the lower death toll is actually due to the fact that there's better living conditions. So with proper infrastructure, with the fact that the drainage system is actually well developed, this will actually reduce the chances of the outbreak of certain insect-borne diseases or waterborne diseases. So therefore it suggests that the rate of spread will be slower should it actually emerge in a country. So whenever you're trying to explain why there is actually lower death toll, do consider these 3 points and make sure that you explain them in great detail. Alright, and the next, what you do notice is that in developed countries, they are also more vulnerable to degenerative diseases. So when it comes to degenerative diseases, they are not contagious. It's mostly linked to things like heart diseases, stroke, or any form of cancer. So when we are talking about degenerative diseases, most of the time it's actually associated to the lifestyle choices of the people as well as their diet. So in the chapter of food, you have studied that in developed nations, the diet comprised of more non-staple food items such as meat, and therefore it contains greater amounts of fat, which can actually lead to obesity and other health complications. And at the same time, given that you have the awareness that in a developed country, there is actually higher disposable income with the ability to actually seek help from domestic helpers or to rely on technology, people tend to live a sedentary lifestyle, basically with greater amount of disposable income. It's actually encouraging physical inactivity, which therefore allows the population to be more vulnerable to degenerative diseases. Alright, so even though the populations within developed nations are more vulnerable to degenerative diseases, right, you do notice that the death toll from degenerative diseases are generally declining at a slow rate, and this is actually due to two things. Number one would be that there is actually increasing awareness on the importance of a healthy lifestyle, and number two would be that because of the fact that there is actually quality healthcare within the developed nations. And because of this, even though the populations are vulnerable to degenerative diseases, you still notice that the life expectancy is generally higher in DCs as compared to LDCs. Alright, so that's one thing to take note of when it comes to developed countries. And next, when we talk about less developed country, you do notice that there's higher death toll from infectious diseases, and they're less vulnerable to degenerative diseases. So just to sum it up, key learning point would be that all countries are vulnerable to infectious diseases, be it DCs or LDCs, and the reason is because of the fact that there's greater mobility of the populations around the world, and this is facilitated by the transportation industry, all the different technological advancements. So if someone is infected with a particular disease and they travel, this can actually facilitate the relocation, diffusion of that particular disease, introducing the disease to a brand new location, right? So similar to DCs, they're vulnerable to the spread. However, unlike the developed nations, when there is infectious disease emerging in an LDC, you do notice that the rate of spread is faster, the scale of spread is larger, and the death toll is higher. Okay, and this is because of the following, and you do notice that the points are pretty much the same, right? So we have education, healthcare, as well as living conditions. So if we talk about education, right, within the less developed nation, you do notice that the level of education is lower, and because of this, there is generally a lack of awareness on the disease itself, how it spreads, what are some of the symptoms, and the impacts of it. So that's one, and they're less informed on the precautionary measures, so they are less likely to be able to protect themselves. And lastly, because of the fact that there is actually lower levels of education, in the long run, it suggests that the adults will have lower disposable income, which limits their ability to have greater access to quality healthcare. Alright, so they will find that healthcare is less affordable. And even if it is affordable, it might not be available within the LDC itself. Alright, so because the fact that we have studied in LDCs, because of the limited financial capacity, governments might not have enough resources to invest in the healthcare sector, because that might not be the priority of the country. Okay, and lastly, because of the fact that they have poorer living conditions, I'm talking about things like the infrastructure itself, or let's say even if we are talking about the roads, if they're not maintained, there are potholes, and then stagnant water can accumulate, and this can actually facilitate the outbreak of insect-borne diseases, right? Or if you are talking about let's say because of the fact that there is not enough safe drinking water within that particular community, people might resort to the drinking of water that are untreated, and therefore this can actually facilitate the spread of waterborne diseases such as cholera. So we are talking about all this all these points that are pretty much relevant to LDCs, and we have actually talked about it in many other chapters as well. So So this 2 points, primarily healthcare and living conditions, explains the high infant mortality rate as well as the low life expectancy within LDCs. Okay, so another thing to take note of when you are studying about the less developed nations would be that they're less vulnerable to degenerative diseases, and same thing is got to do with what you've studied in the chapter of food. And it is because if you look at the diet, it's primarily grain-based diet, so you do notice that it is pretty much low fat, and also do notice that in terms of their lifestyles, they're engaging in high rates of physical activity, primarily due to the nature of their work. So some of them may be agricultural farmers. They have to be in the field most of the time, and therefore, because of the physical activity, they're less vulnerable to all the different degenerative diseases that you do notice within developed countries. However, there's an anomaly. So because of the fact that smoking is prevalent within LDCs, you do notice that lung cancer is one of the problems, the main degenerative disease that you observe within LDCs. Okay, so all in all, you do notice that even though these are some of the key points that you notice in LDCs, they are not very much prevalent within the emerging economies. And we've studied this under the chapter of food as well. So BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, because of the fact that they're developing rapidly, the people have high disposable income, and therefore their lifestyles are pretty much similar to that of the people within the developed nations, and therefore they are vulnerable to degenerative diseases. Okay, I realize I've been talking very quickly, but I hope you can catch what I'm saying. Alright, so now we're going to talk about infectious diseases. So we have endemic and epidemic as well as pandemic. So we have 3 different types. They vary in terms of scale primarily. And now let's start with endemic. It is something that is constantly present within a community at very low levels. So we have something like malaria or cholera, and the thing is that it's usually affecting the less developed countries. So the reason is because if you think about this, if a particular disease is constantly present within a society, a community itself, it does suggest to you that that particular community have limited availability and access to healthcare, right? At the same time, it also does suggest to you that the environmental conditions will probably be poor. So something like they have limited access to safe drinking water, and that's why cholera is constantly present. Okay, so the idea of it being constantly present does suggest to us that it is likely an LDC, and at the same time, the citizens may be less willing to seek medical attention, and the reason is because since it's constantly present within their community, they don't see that something that is urgent enough to seek any form of medical attention. And I've watched this TED Talk. I'll put the link down in the description box below. And if you have the time to go and have a look, it's quite a long TED Talk, but it's really worth it. It's talking about how the international organizations, or if I'm not wrong, it's the NGOs, that are distributing bed nets to the less developed communities that are vulnerable to malaria. So we do understand that most of the communities in the less developed nations, because of the fact that the infrastructures are not equipped with proper doors and windows, and they're often out and about. So by providing them with bed nets, so at night they're less vulnerable to mosquito bites, which therefore allows them to be less vulnerable to malaria itself. So you think it's a good idea and it's free for them to use, but because of the fact that malaria is constantly present within their community, they don't see the need to actually implement the use of all these precautionary measures that the NGOs have offered to them. So that's why if citizens find it unnecessary to seek any form of medical attention, then this will actually facilitate the spread of the disease within the community. Alright, so that's something about endemic. And next we have epidemics. When it comes to epidemics itself, the characteristic would be that it is sudden. It is sudden and large outbreak of a particular infectious disease. So for instance, if you are thinking about examples, it can be cholera. So in this case, think about those natural disasters. Hurricane Katrina is one, and in fact that's a very good example to talk about, because we understand that for tropical cyclones, one of the main impact is flooding caused by torrential rain and storm surge. So when the flood waters actually recede and they're drained out, you do notice that there may be stagnant pools of water that are left behind. So these are favorable environmental conditions for mosquitoes to thrive in, and therefore this can actually facilitate insect-borne diseases. At the same time, because of the flood waters that are present, this can actually contaminate the drinking supply, and this will actually lead to waterborne diseases such as cholera. So cholera, it's usually an epidemic in regions that have just experienced natural disasters such as tropical cyclones, or sometimes we have earthquakes. So one good example that's in your textbook is about Haiti, so you can talk about that as well. Alright, so the key understanding is that it's sudden large outbreak, and do notice that epidemics tend to affect both DCs and LDCs. So like I said just now, Hurricane Katrina is affecting USA, which is a developed nation. Alright, so one interesting thing to note is that because it's sudden, the sudden nature suggests that the disease can actually spread rapidly. And the reason is because if it's happening suddenly, it means that the citizens are ill prepared, and they may not have put in place precautionary measures. Same goes to the government, and the number of deaths is actually determined by the accessibility and the quality of healthcare at a point in time when the disease emerged. So in this case, if you think about, if there is an outbreak of cholera within a community and it is an LDC, you would expect high death toll because of the fact that there is limited healthcare facilities, limited, the doctor-patient ratio is actually very large, and in terms of accessibility, that might be one thing. So do take note that the death toll is often associated with the quality and the availability of healthcare at a point in time. Alright, so next would be pandemic. Pandemic itself is pretty much something that's happening on a larger scale. So it can be global scale or it can be regional scale of spread of infectious diseases. So one good example would be SARS. For Singapore's case, we've experienced it. And then the next example, which is pretty dated, is the Spanish influenza. It happened in 1918. So both examples work, and do take note that the spread of pandemic is actually due to the mobility of populations around the world, and in order to curb this and to reduce the spread, it's important for countries to cooperate and to actually give out the necessary travel advisories to reduce the people coming into the country that are carrying that particular disease, so that this can actually limit the scale of spread. Alright, so the next thing that we're going to go through would be malaria. So some of the key things to take note of would be that it spreads through female Anopheles mosquitoes. So do take note, it's female mosquitoes. So something that I taught my students to consider would be dengue fever. It's also an insect-borne disease, and because of the fact that the female mosquitoes are the carrier of that particular disease, right? Singapore's strategy was to release male mosquitoes to actually curb the population of the female mosquitoes. So it's something that's interesting that you can take note of. So do take note, if you are talking about certain strategies, it's good to include certain details. And it's primarily spread through expansion diffusion. So expansion diffusion basically means that the disease itself is spreading from the point of origin outwards. So if the primary spread is through expansion diffusion, region, then do take note that usually it will be made worse if the living conditions are overcrowded. Alright, so if we think about overcrowdedness, then you got the link to the level of development of a country, which is usually more prevalent within LDCs. Alright, and then next will be scale of spread. You do notice that the scale of spread of malaria is usually facilitated with relocation diffusion, and we've mentioned it. So basically it's talking about the mobility of populations. Okay, so next would be that it's most widespread in tropical and subtropical zones. Do note, if you look at the world map, tropical and subtropical regions around the world, most of them are actually LDCs. So, given that most of the LDCs are concentrated within this region, it suggests that they have less financial resources to invest in two things: healthcare as well as education. So, if there is a lack of resources invested into education, it then suggests that the people are less prepared and equipped with the necessary knowledge, and they will have less disposable income to actually have access to healthcare. We've talked about this, so yeah, that's basically the main idea. At the same time, since most of the LDCs are concentrated within this region, it suggests that their living conditions would be very much poorer as well. So this might suggest that the drainage system may not be as efficient, and then they might experience overcrowding living conditions, and there might be insufficient proper doors and windows in the infrastructures, which therefore can be something that facilitates the spread of malaria. And since they're located within this region, it may suggest that the LDCs may experience a monsoon climate, so countries like India. Alright, so because of this, it may then suggest that they will be more vulnerable to malaria, because after the monsoon season, the rainfall, the amount of stagnant water will actually increase drastically. So this will actually facilitate the breeding of mosquitoes. And then lastly, because of the fact that most of the LDC populations and individuals, the kind of lifestyle that they're leading allows them to be constantly out and about. So it suggests that they are constantly outdoors, and therefore it might suggest that they are more vulnerable to insect bites and mosquito bites, and therefore this can actually worsen the spread of malaria by increasing the rate as well as the spread of malaria. Alright, so lastly, also take note that because of the fact that with recent changes in the climatic conditions, with global warming that's happening, this can actually facilitate the scale of spread of malaria around the world. And the reason is because if the global temperatures are increasing, it suggests that malaria is no longer going to be confined within the tropical as well as the subtropical regions around the world. Okay, so I hope this is useful in helping you understand about malaria. And next, we have HIV/AIDS. Alright, so HIV/AIDS, basically it's transmitted through four main points. Number one, sexual contact. Number two, sharing of infected needles. Number three, blood transfusion. And number four, pregnant mothers to their babies. Alright, so basically for sexual contact as well as sharing of infected needles, this is actually the extent of spread is actually determined by the level of education within the community, the lifestyle choices of the population, as well as the presence of vice traits within the area as well. And most important thing is to take note that it's not just limited to LDCs, because lifestyle choices and vice traits, they are also prevalent within DCs, right? So that's why HIV/AIDS is not a disease that's confined within LDCs, but most of the deaths are usually from LDCs. Okay, I mean the higher death toll is actually from LDCs. Okay, so next would be blood transfusion. It's usually due to the lapses in medical practices, and this is usually associated to lower quality of healthcare because of all this oversight. So therefore it's usually associated to LDCs. And then next would be pregnant mothers to babies, and this is actually determined by whether or not the population, the pregnant mothers, are able to afford the costly antenatal treatment, which reduces the chance of them spreading the HIV virus to their babies. So yeah, the most important thing to remember out of all this point is to recognize that it's not confined within LDCs. Alright, so the rate of spread of HIV/AIDS through expansion diffusion is usually closely linked to education levels. Like we've said before, education itself will determine the awareness of the particular disease and whether or not the people are able to take the necessary precautionary measures. With greater amount of awareness, people would therefore then be more willing to seek medical treatment. And lastly, level of education would then determine their ability to afford the high cost of antiretroviral therapy. So there are two things to take note of. Antenatal treatment is primarily for pregnant mothers. Antiretroviral therapy is primarily for those who are affected and infected with HIV/AIDS. It basically stops the virus from spreading within the body and progressing within the body. Alright, so do take note of the difference between these two. And next would be the scale of spread through relocation diffusion is usually facilitated by two things. Number one would be the mobility, we've talked about it, and number two would be the difficulties in HIV detection. So because of the fact that HIV cannot be detected immediately, usually you will only see the symptoms after many years, sometimes 10 years. Therefore, it is since people can be carriers of that particular disease for such a long period of time, and if they engage in risk-taking behaviors, then you do notice that this will actually facilitate the scale as well as the rate of spread. Alright, so yeah, I hope that HIV/AIDS itself, this whole overview is actually easy for you to understand, and do take some time to really read through them in detail. And lastly, we have oops. Alright, and lastly we have, are we more vulnerable than before? And our vulnerability is actually dependent on the type of infectious disease. So if we want to say that we are more vulnerable than before, we need to look at which type of disease we're talking about. And in this case, if we're looking at malaria, yes, we are more vulnerable than before, because if you look at malaria, the way it's spread, it can emerge in new areas simply because of the fact that if you look at the world's climatic conditions, it's changing rapidly. We're experiencing global warming, and therefore this particular disease can be introduced in areas that are beyond the tropical and subtropical regions. And malaria may re-emerge in areas that have once experienced malaria itself, and this is because of the fact that there is limitations to healthcare. So things like we are more resistant to anti-malaria drugs. I mean, not we, but the virus itself. And the thing is that mosquitoes can also be more resistant to insecticides. So therefore, they can actually re-emerge in areas that have once been affected and plagued with malaria. Alright, and next would be HIV/AIDS. If you look at HIV/AIDS itself, are we more vulnerable than before? Definitely, and the reason is because HIV detection is very difficult and it takes a long time. So people can be carriers of that particular disease and yet not carry on with their daily lives and not be aware. And next would be that if you look around the world, be it developed nations or less developed nations, the lifestyle choices, people are engaging with risk-taking behaviors, and the use of illegal drugs, the sharing of needles can actually promote and facilitate the spread. And because of social stigma. Now, this is something that is present especially within DCs, because of the fact that there is still misconception about the disease itself. People are ashamed to share that they are HIV positive, and because of that, they're less willing to seek any form of medical treatment, and they may continue to spread the disease as well. So social stigma plays a very important role, not just within LDCs but in DCs as well. Alright, and lastly, we have the high cost of treatment. So basically, antiretroviral therapy is very costly, and it is something that the patient has to take for the rest of their lives. So think about this: if it adds on a lot of financial burden for the individual and for the family, then some of them might choose to not carry on with the treatment. And if they carry on with their risk-taking behaviors, then of course this will actually promote and facilitate the spread of HIV/AIDS. And at the end of the day, if you look at malaria and HIV/AIDS, and any other form of infectious disease, you do notice there's a commonality. And the fact that we are able to travel easily all around the world, this actually makes us more vulnerable than before. And because if travel is so easy and so affordable in recent years, it suggests that if one person is infected with that particular disease, it can actually spread easily to other countries, and new disease can actually emerge in other countries, and this can actually lead to epidemic, or if worse, it can actually lead to pandemics. So given that we can travel so easily and freely, and tickets are so affordable in recent years, it suggests that if one person is affected with a particular infectious disease, this can easily be spread to other countries through relocation diffusion, and it emerge in new countries, and they might not be prepared with the necessary measures, and the healthcare services and healthcare sector might not be able to handle the situation effectively. This can actually result in the outbreak of an epidemic or even a pandemic. And yeah, definitely we are more vulnerable than before, and we can never be completely prepared with mitigation or preparedness measures for all kinds of infectious diseases. So this is something that we have to be aware as a society, and be it developed or less developed countries. So in terms of the measures, you do know that in your textbook, every single chapter, there are strategies that countries can actually implement. And in this case, we are looking at individuals, communities, and governments and organizations. How can we manage the spread of infectious diseases? And I would say that for all the different groups of people who are involved in helping to manage the spread itself, government will definitely play the most important role. And the reason is because the government is the one that has the authority to actually put in place different strategies, different measures. So in the case of Singapore, let's say when there was a SARS outbreak, the government was the first to step in to actually shut down schools, and to actually isolate individuals, and to track and trace back to who are the individuals who are the carriers of the disease, and effectively control and contain the disease, and then use the different media outlets to inform the citizens, to let them be aware of the different precautionary measures. And this can actually effectively contain the disease and reduce the rate of spread, and issue out the necessary travel advisories. So government plays a very important role, followed by the individuals as well as the communities, to actually propose the necessary measures and to exercise social responsibility. And then finally, when there are epidemics that are happening at different parts around the world, international organizations as well as NGOs can step in to propose strategies. But at the end of the day, the effectiveness of international organizations and NGOs are pretty much limited, because I would say that their proposed strategies have to be adopted by the government, and this requires strong political willpower, and it also requires the government to have the financial resources to carry out all the strategies. So when you are studying for the last chapter, do take note that I mean, not just for the chapter of health, but most of the chapters, in terms of the roles of different groups of people, the government certainly plays a more important role due to the level of authority that they have, as well as the resources that they can distribute to the different communities that are the most vulnerable. Alright, so I hope you found this video useful, and we've come to the end of all 6 chapters of geography for O and N level students. And yeah, this whole process was very interesting, stressful and tiring, but fruitful and fulfilling. So my main aim of creating all these videos is really just to share whatever that I know and I've learned as a teacher for the past 5 years. And yeah, so if you found any value, do feel free to pass it on and share it with your juniors, because I hope that students can actually view this subject as something that is not too intimidating, and it's something that's fun and relevant to their daily lives. If you turn on the news, you do notice that a lot of what they're talking about right now are pretty much what we have studied, and we can actually associate with it. And if you travel overseas and you look at certain landforms, you are like, I know how it's formed. Yeah, I find it exciting to do that. Alright, so yeah, stay tuned to this channel. I will continue to post, but it would be different types of content rather than just geography content itself. And yeah, do stay tuned, and hopefully it'll be something that's exciting. I'm pretty excited. Just squeeze all my creative juices, and yeah, we'll see each other soon. And if you're watching this because you are a geography student, and if you still do have questions, do put them down in the comments below. Do DM me, I'm still here. So I will definitely find time to reply you. So till then, stay tuned, and we'll see each other in the next episode, and bye.